Good morning, everyone, or hello, because I don't know what time of day it is where you are or when you'll be watching. But welcome to WYO Global Connections. WYO Global Connections is an initiative of the Center for Global Studies at the University of Wyoming. And we are inaugurating it as, in this tumultuous end to 2020, but in celebration of International Education Week, hosted by the Global Engagement Office at UW. So let's all keep looking forward to the global opportunities the future will bring for UW's faculty and students and our international colleagues who will be visiting us here in the future. So Wyoming Global Connections aims to showcase conversations between Wyoming faculty and their international partners. These conversations highlight the work that we share around the world and the opportunities Wyoming's international collaborations bring to UW students. I am Caroline McCracken-Flesher. I'm director for the Center for Global Studies. And today it's my pleasure to introduce UW's own Seth Ward from Philosophy and Religious Studies in conversation with Professor Moshe Pinchuk from Netanya Academic College in Israel. Dr. Ward needs very little introduction at the University of Wyoming. He's a religious studies scholar specializing in Islam, Judaism, and Israel studies, and he's very active in the community, introducing us to all the questions that these days we need to address. So welcome, Dr. Ward. And Dr. Pinchuk heads the Jewish Heritage Center at Netanya Academic College, and he's dialing in from Israel today. He studies parallels between Greek and biblical narratives. His primary research focuses on Jerusalem Talmud studies, and the Jerusalem Talmud comprises a large body of law and legal discussion spanning roughly the 1st to the 5th century. Dr. Pinchuk has developed the Talmud Yerushalmi database. I can't actually say that phrase, but not under pressure, obviously. A reference base that includes all known manuscripts of the Talmud. Dr. Pinchuk is a longtime friend of UW. He's hosted UW students at his home in Israel, and he's led them on tours of biblical sites. So welcome, Dr. Pinchuk.
Hello, good evening from Israel.
Now, this is a conversation that we're about to start for our audience, and you're very welcome to participate. To do so, you should please use the Q&A function in Zoom. The administrators are going to look out for your questions, and we're going to relay them to the speakers. If we run out of time for the questions, please be assured that we'll pass your questions on to the speakers nonetheless. So our colleagues in education abroad also are very keen to hear any questions that you might have about studying in Israel. So all participants, please include your email with your question so that we can get back to you just in case we run out of time. That's going to be in the private chat. As I say, we will relay your questions to the speakers. And so now, as in all the best conversations, the host is going to step aside and let the conversation commence. So over to you, Dr. Ward and Dr. Pinchuk.
Well, thank you very, very much. I'm very excited to begin this program. I think the question we'll begin with is a very simple one. If Shem and Japheth could hear each other over the din at the Buckhorn Bar, what would they have to say to one another, and what values can we gain from listening into their conversation?
Okay, so good morning, good evening to each at his own, and thank you very much, I guess, first of all, to Seth for inviting me to participate, and to the Center for Global Studies at the University of Wyoming, and to all others who are involved. Yeah, so if the sons of Shem and Japheth actually met at the bar, and maybe I should say that me and Seth, or Seth and I, have on occasion actually stepped into a bar, into this bar, albeit closer to the stomping grounds of David and Goliath rather than Laramie. I guess the first question would probably be, what language would they speak? Hebrew or some type of Semitic dialect or Greek? Yes, but what would they talk about, and why would they want to talk to each other? If I can rephrase your question. So let me say that comparisons have actually always fascinated me. Comparisons between any two things, because anytime you compare between things, you have an opportunity to see how different cultures actually deal with the same challenges and often offer different solutions. And that, in my opinion, or in my experience, is fascinating to see the same problem being dealt with in different ways by different cultures. And comparisons also offer you an opportunity for a much deeper understanding of your own subject matter. Now I'm going to go off at a quick tangent just to give you an example, and we'll start from the Bible then. At the very beginning of the Bible, we have the children, not of Shem and Yafet, but of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, both bringing a sacrifice to God. And it's interesting, I mean, Cain was the first. He invented the concept of bringing a sacrifice, and he brings the sacrifice, and he's happy. And then Abel brings the sacrifice, and we're told that God responds favorably to his sacrifice. And only afterwards does the Bible tell us, and to Cain's sacrifice, God did not respond. And for a long time, I was bothered by the question, why is this out of order? The Bible should have said, Cain brought a sacrifice, no response. Abel brought a sacrifice, a positive response. Until I finally realized that when Cain brought his sacrifice, he had no idea what to expect. You know, he brought a sacrifice, and this was never done before. So whatever happens, he's happy. And it's only after God does respond to Abel in a positive way, I don't know what happened there, suddenly Cain has something to compare to. And based on this comparison, he realizes, hey, I did not get the response, and therefore his face falls, as they say. But this is, I think, a very beautiful example where you see that the ability to compare tells you something not only about the other that you're comparing to, but it tells you something about yourself. So that was just like a very small digression, just to illuminate how sometimes comparison really teaches you about yourself. The reasons that I am so fascinated by Greek and biblical and rabbinic comparisons, I guess is because, first of all, I mean, the two pillars of Western philosophy are really, philosophy and culture, are Greek philosophy and culture on the one hand, and the Bible on the other. And it's really these two pillars together are what have generated what we know today and for the past so many years as Western culture and Western philosophy. And I think it's interesting, important for us as members of this Western philosophy and culture to understand those two pillars that we're coming from and to see what each pillar had to offer and contribute to our culture in a unique way. Going on to rabbinic literature, I mean, the truth is that rabbinic literature, to a very large degree, was created in the milieu of Hellenism. And it's fascinating for me, again, as a person whose study is Jewish studies, to see how this was influenced the creation of all this Jewish literature under the gaze of Hellenism. So that's just to answer why would they want to talk? Why would Shem and Yafet want to talk? I mean, maybe we didn't make this clear. The children of Shem would be the Jewish culture and literature, and the children of Japheth, as a matter of fact, Greece, Yavan, are one of his children. So this really works out. The children of Shem would be the Jewish, and the children of Japheth, at least Yavan, would be the Greek society, and that's what they're meeting and speaking about at the bar.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like you to give an example or two. You've taken our UW students to a location according to your reconstruction of David and Goliath. And maybe you can tell us just a little bit about how the David and Goliath stories compare and what values we might get from that.
Yeah, well, actually, I'll get to David and Goliath in a moment. Maybe I'll start from something much more basic. And this was actually my first exposure to the fact that there are similarities between Greek and Jewish sources. But let me take you back now earlier than Shem and Japheth. Let me take you back to their parents, to Adam and Eve, who were actually created by God. And as a post-high school student, I decided that I was going to read Plato, the Symposium of Plato, and I was fascinated there. I don't know how much I understood, but what I was fascinated was by this story that Aristophanes had to offer about the creation of Adam and Eve, or basically of man and woman, of male and female. And as I was reading him describing this hermaphrodite type of entity, which Zeus split down the middle to create a male and female, it reminded me a lot of one of the interpretations of the creation of Adam and Eve in the Bible. I mean, our childhood interpretation is that God just, took out a rib, snapped out a rib and built Eve around that rib. But the Hebrew word for rib means tzela, can mean a side. And one of the interpretations is that God actually split up this hermaphrodite unit into male and female. I won't get into all the comparisons here, but the thing that struck the most is that those of you who are familiar with the stories of Aristophanes in Plato, over there, Zeus is splitting humanity into two as a punishment. This, this spider-like object with 4 hands and 4 feet would roll around, and they were very powerful and therefore very arrogant. And Zeus comes along, and to stem their arrogance, he splits them into 2. And then he warns them, if they continue to be arrogant, he'll split them again, and they'll hop around like grasshoppers on a single foot. Was a punishment to make man smaller. But when you read the biblical story, over there, the creation of man and woman and this split is offered by God in order to enlarge man, in order to give him a better and a more meaningful life. And that was quite an eye-opener for me. It's the same story, the same issue, and the Bible introduces is at God trying to forward man, and Zeus is trying, in the Greek philosophy, it's introduced or presented as a punishment of God belittling man. That was really the first time I ever noticed a similarity between Jewish and Greek stories, and these small differences meant so much to me, or taught me so much, as far as the different outlooks of these two cultures go. But that was just something I had to get off my chest, because I figured that's like the first time I was exposed to these things, so I figured I'd share that with you. Going to David and Goliath, what am I comparing it to? I mean, we have the story of David and Goliath. Here, the comparison was actually to other examples of single combats that we're so familiar with in Greek literature. I mean, what happens in the story of David and Goliath? They're at war. These two armies are at war. And suddenly Goliath steps out and he says, and it sounds like a really nice suggestion. He says, why should we be killing each other so much? Let's have a single combat, and winner takes all. And just imagine how many lives we'll be saving. And apparently that's what they do. This is something which to the Jews there is completely novel. But if you go to Greek literature, you'll find that this is quite often. I mean, in the Trojan Wars, in the Iliad, you find a number of these single combats which are meant to decide the war. And over here, what I tried to show was that there are really 2 types of single combat. There's one type of single combat which seems quite altruistic. We're trying to obviate or avoid a full battle. So let's just have a battle between 2 commanders, and that should decide the war. But then there's another type of single combat that you come across in the Iliad, which is really out of arrogance, where you have these two soldiers, the armies are bored, they're tired, they want some recreation. And these two soldiers say, well, let's have a war between us. It won't decide anything. It won't make a difference. But it'll be interesting for people to watch this war until death, something like the gladiators. And actually here, what I was wondering about is what exactly was Goliath offering? Was he offering a single combat to avoid war? Or was he saying, we've been stuck here for the past 40 days, let's get some amusement out of it. I should mention, and this is important, Goliath is what we know a Philistine. And today, more than ever, archaeology is showing us that the Philistines that we come across in Israel are really descendants of the Mycenaean culture. So in a sense, those Greeks, let's say Homer, who was writing the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Goliath and his friends in Israel are really descendants from the same culture. So it does make sense to try to interpret Goliath's offer, a Philistine, based on his own culture, the culture that we meet in almost a parallel time in history's story of Homer writing the Iliad.
Moshe, I asked you in part because I know that you've taken our students on an exciting tour of the David and Goliath area. Just give them a moment to suggest some of the things that they might encounter if they wanted to know a little bit more about facts on the ground and the trips that we've done together in the area of the Valley of Elah.
Valley of Elah. Yeah, well, that's very exciting. You have to realize the Valley of Elah is basically my backyard. So they have the Bible taking place in my backyard, so I'm always excited about that. So what we have done already for the past, 3 or almost 4 years, I've taken them to an archaeological dig. On one of the slopes of the Elah Valley, they've discovered the Khirbat Kayafa, a pretty large city, which they claim to have been a Jewish city from the time of David, which actually establishes that David had a real kingdom and he just wasn't a tribal chief running around. And standing from that old city, we were basically standing where Saul had his army camped, and you can look across the valley and imagine the army of the Philistines on the other side of the valley. And I think what makes things there really exciting is that you can read the verses of the Bible and actually follow and understand the movements of the two armies. Actually, the Philistines were coming through the valley from the west, from the sea. That's where they lived on the sea, and they're coming in through this valley in order to go up to Jerusalem. Now, Saul and his meager army don't stand a chance against the powerful Philistines with their horses and chariots. If they would go down into the valley to challenge them, they would be literally overrun. So what Saul does is he goes up onto the slope of the mountain so that he can then shoot them safely and stop them. The Philistines realize this, so they change their plans and they go up to the opposite mountain. But now they're in a deadlock or a gridlock. Nobody dares to go down into the valley and up the other side to challenge, because coming up from the bottom, you have the disadvantage. And you understand why Goliath is stuck there for 40 days and he's bored. So he comes out every day and he says, Jews, let's have some amusement. Come out and fight me. So you're standing there and you can understand the various moves which are hinted to in the Bible. And finally, David comes out and wins the day.
Well, part of the goal of these conversations is to share research interest. And I know you and I have had a number of conversations based on comparing the biblical narratives with the Quranic versions of the narratives in terms of Jewish and Islamic studies. And in part, this is motivated by the fact that some of the students in the Netanya Academic College classes come from Muslim backgrounds. Some of them come from Christian backgrounds as well. And it's been useful to compare the stories. Now, in fact, the David and Goliath story also occurs in the Quran. It's a little bit less interest to do the comparison because it's just a reference and there's not much to talk about. But you did mention Cain and Abel, and I'd like to just share an interesting perspective. Cain and Abel are mentioned famously in the Mishnah, and I believe it's discussed in the Yerushalmi as well as in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Mishnah, which talks about vetting witnesses in capital cases. And the context is quite interesting, and it leads in both the Quran and in the Mishnah to a statement that a person who kills a single soul is considered to have killed an entire nation, entire world rather, and conversely, a person who saves a single soul is considered to have saved the world entire. In that context, it's quite clear that the Cain and Abel story is used midrashically, as it were, to support the statement, which occurs in both the Quran and the Bible. And that whole deliberation about who was first and why and how they came to be is just missing from the Quranic text. This is a very interesting way of comparing the two materials. I'd like to move on a little bit to the Yerushalmi. In honor of our conversation, I have as a background a page from the Leiden manuscript. And why don't you tell us a little bit about the database that you've put together and about studying the various manuscripts. I also believe that my colleague, Professor Flesher, is listening, and if you have any comments about the history of synagogue buildings or the history of appurtenances the synagogues might have that come out of your current work on Masechet Megillah and Yerushalmi, that might be of particular interest as well.
Sure. Okay. So yes, I mean you've put up a snapshot of the only existing manuscript of the Talmud Yerushalmi that we have. For anybody who works with the manuscripts or with texts, the bread and water, not bread and butter, but the bread and water is actual manuscripts. And if we're talking about comparison, when you try to reconstruct what the supposedly original or first text which was written was, you do this by comparing manuscripts and trying to decide which one has the less corrupt or the more original text. That's what philology, well, at least in Jewish studies, is all about. And the problem with the Talmud Yerushalmi is that we have only one manuscript. So what are you going to compare it to? So of course I'm exaggerating a little bit because we do have bits and pieces of manuscripts which have been found over the years in the Cairo Geniza, in the European Geniza, which in itself is a fascinating story. As you see, I mean, most of the manuscripts are written on parchment, and parchment is quite expensive and quite useful. So at a certain point in the Middle Ages, what was happening is that the cities were confiscating all these books on a parchment from the Jews, and they were recycling them. They were using them in order to make folders or covers for their own manuscripts. And this has been a very exciting, actually, discovery in the past, I would say, 40 years. You can go through the different archives of the cities all around Europe, and you'll find that the municipal documents are housed in these folders, which are made out of ancient Jewish parchment with texts on them. And a lot of different things have been discovered there. In particular, some fragments of the Talmud Yerushalmi have been discovered in these covers. But getting back to us, having said all that, still the manuscripts are rare and very, very partial. And one of the other solutions in order to generate Yerushalmi text to which we compare is to go through medieval works, Jewish medieval works, and you find that every now and then they actually quote a little snippet of Yerushalmi. And you go through, and if you theoretically, if you would collect all these snippets and allusions to Yerushalmi in this wealth of medieval Jewish literature, you could amass quite an amount of testimonies of what their version of the Yerushalmi was. And this is exactly what I've been doing, I guess, for the past 20 years. Now when it's on computer, things are much easier. So you have this gigantic storehouse database of, by now it's 32,000 records of little bits and snippets of Yerushalmi. And when you study the Yerushalmi, you can then retrieve all this medieval information which talks about the piece of Yerushalmi that you were studying. And this does give you a partial solution to the absence of manuscripts. We've kind of like reconstructed or reinvented manuscripts out of bits and pieces that the medieval sages have saved for us. I mean, imagine taking a manuscript and running it through one of those machines that, you know, through a shredder, and you get like a zillion little bits and lines of Yerushalmi, and then you try to reassemble that. And based on that assembly, you actually get a new version of the Yerushalmi. That more or less is what you're able to do using this, this database.
I wonder if you can spend a few moments. I think you are aware, I don't know how many of our listeners are aware that I've been working for about 20, 25 years in various ways with descendants of Jews who became Catholics, and they became believing Catholics as a result of the Inquisition. Now, they would often say they were converted because of the Inquisition. Well, that's not technically true, but they certainly became believing Catholics in Spain because after 1492, practicing Jews were expelled, and any Jew who wanted to stay in Spain had to practice as a Catholic. In 1497, the Jewish community in Portugal met a similar fate. They were forcibly converted. I know that Netanya Academic College has a Center for Crypto-Jewish Studies. I wonder if you can spend a few moments talking about the center.
Yeah, well, first of all, that center certainly takes a warm spot in my heart for two reasons. I mean, I was at the time when it was when we founded it, I was very much involved in the founding of it and in bringing the proper people there. At the time, we were in touch with a Mrs. Gloria Mound, who has since passed away, and she had amassed a tremendous library and tremendous amount of knowledge also about all these crypto Jews, all these Jews who were forced to convert, but in secret held on to more or to less Jewish what's it called? Traditions. So that's one reason. The other reason is that we mentioned when we started talking tonight is that's actually how Seth and myself have met. At the time he came, he was a friend and involved with this Gloria Mound. He came out to Netanya Academic College, and since we have become both colleagues and friends. As we mentioned before, we actually go to bars together whenever we're both in the same in the same country. Yeah, so this center, this research center for crypto Jews, is one of the many research centers that we have at the Netanya Academic College. I mean, myself, I'm the head of the Jewish Heritage Center, and this is another parallel center. There's quite a library there. And I think what's special about this research center is that it not only does research, but it also does reach out. Quite a number of people and this is from the days of Gloria, who know about the center, have reached out to us and contacted us trying to, first of all, understand what their roots are, where they're coming from. Are they descendants of Jews? Who are they descendants of? Sometimes that's all they're interested in. Sometimes they're interested in converting back to Judaism. But the point is that this center actually deals with real people with these real roots and the descendants of these crypto Jews. So that I find very, very interesting and gratifying, is that you actually get to meet the real people. It's as if all your objects of research kind of step out of the page and you're able to converse with them.
Well, speaking about objects of research stepping out of the page, there is a Q&A from Professor Flesher, who said, you know, Bible, I'm paraphrasing his question, I hope in a fair way, Bible and Greek mythology, they're pretty old. And do you find there's any contemporary relevance for Athens and Jerusalem today, from the stories and the conversations and the parallels that you're looking at?
I don't know if that's a fair question to ask me, because I would say this is what's relevant to me, is to understand what was in the past, but it's certainly a fair enough question. I think that the main relevance and importance nowadays, again, is for a person to be able to understand his own culture and to understand how he reached the place and the situation where he is today. And by learning about your past, by learning about parallel pasts of parallel cultures and how they interacted, you gain a deeper and stronger understanding of what you're doing here and today. I don't know if I can say this, but I do think this. I mean, this might be especially relevant in Israel. You know, Israel is quite a place, quite a challenge to live here. You have different dangers and hardships. And in order to live here, you have to be convinced in the meaning and in the importance of your being here, and the fact that I'm speaking, of course, as a Jew now. And without understanding how history brought you here, why make the effort? You know, it could be easier to live in other places, but this entire package of history that you have behind you certainly helps you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it here and now. Yeah, I mean, I can give you an example. Again, you could argue whether this is really that important, but the whole concept of a week and of a sabbatical, of a day of rest, is really completely strange and alien to Greek philosophy and Greek culture. If you're, and I'm going back to a comparison now, and if you, for example, if you read Hesiod, the Theogony, there is no God there who created the world in a set time and began at A and ended in Z and had a rest day. You know, the world just started flowing and happening in almost a deterministic way. So the concept of a week, of the cyclical week, and the concept of a day of rest, it was absolutely strange and bizarre to any ancient Greek. And the Hellenists, I mean, the Greeks, were constantly criticizing the Jews for this crazy idea of having a rest day every 7 days, even though they themselves did have holidays. And for the Jews, or for all those who read the Bible, the concept of a 7-day week is almost natural. This is the time that it took for God to create the world, and he rested on the seventh day, and in commemoration of that, we rest on the 7th day as well. It becomes an almost natural part of your culture. And this, I think, is quite amazing. I mean, this is actually one of the probably contributions of the biblical pillar to Western philosophy, is the contribution of the idea of a 7-day week. and the idea of a day of rest. Without this, we'd be working not 24/7, but 24/70 years. So I think these things are important for us to realize and understand, even nowadays, to understand what where the 7-day week comes from. What is the rationale of a rest day? Certainly in today's atmosphere, we all try to work and gain as much as we can. It seems almost counterintuitive to stop every 7 days and rest. Why not continue working?
So I have a few questions coming in here from the audience to add into your discussion. And thank you both so much for getting this great start. Someone's following up on the observation you made and the phrase you used, Dr. Pinchuk, about the Bible in my backyard, right? The Bible in my backyard, which is such a powerful phrase and really interesting to contemplate. And the question is this. Israel's a pretty small country, right? And Israel West Bank is a small area. What do you think, if someone was visiting for a short time, what are the really key sites, that would allow you to get the sense, in addition to the one you described, that expresses really powerfully what it might have meant for Goliath to say, "Come out and fight me." What are the 2 or 3 sites that you would say someone really should visit to get a sense of cultures piled up on top of one another, over generations? If you could pick your 2 go-to or your 3, what would those be?
Well, obviously, you is. I mean, I imagine that if I was coming as a Christian pilgrim, I would be interested in one thing. If I was coming as a Mormon, I'd be interested in other sites. As a Jew, in other sites. If I was coming as a Chinese businessman, I'd be interested probably in Tel Aviv. So, of course, my answer is going to be completely subjective. But the truth is that if we're just talking about these cultures piled up one on top of another, you can find that almost at any historical site. Invariably, no matter what site you go to. I mean, let's take Nebi Samuel's grave, which is situated just out of Jerusalem. You have piled up there, you have it's an ancient Jewish site. This is where Samuel the prophet is buried. On top of that, you have a Christian church. That actually was the point of departure when the Crusaders in 1099 came to conquer the land. That was their point of departure, to capture Jerusalem. And then you have, on top of that, you have Muslim mosques. Invariably, almost any site, you can see how all the different religions pile up there, each one trying to claim it for itself. That's part of our troubles in Israel, because each religion wants it for itself. So if you want those 3 key sites, then you'd have the Temple Mount, of course, where the Jews and the Muslims each claim it for itself. You have in Hebron, you have the burial grounds of the forefathers, which again, each religion claims for itself. And you have in Nablus, you have Joseph's grave. Also, each one calls it for itself. Any place you step, you'd always find at least 3 layers: Jewish, Muslim, and Christian. So if you're looking for the sandwich, I would say take your choice. Any place is good. If you can narrow down your interests, not that I'm a tourist guide, but I can give you some of my favorite places. The Chirbat Kayafa was fascinating for me, and the Hukok was another place. This is a synagogue, which actually University of Wyoming, I think Paul was involved there, which is amazing. But really any site, you get to see just how intense history can get.
I think some of the things that are really surprising to people when they visit for the first time is exactly that, and unexpected things, such as the Holy Sepulchre has so many varieties of Christianity trying to occupy it, that in fact the people who are in charge of the keys are Muslim, because it reduces conflict. But I would like to pick up also on behalf of students here, your comment about digs in Israel and some of the more exciting ones that are available. And I'm not sure if Paul Flesher is actually with us to participate in this conversation too. If you are, Paul, do come in. But you talked a little bit about Hukok, and of course it's the one that discovered the remarkable mosaics, right? Mosaics that, there he is, that I think we're not in the line of the usual, right? And then I believe there's Megiddo where we've been, and I'm trying to remember the name of the other one, Paul, where you sent students, and perhaps the three of you can tell us about the opportunities for students specifically at digs. Paul, you are muted at present.
Okay, so anyway, I was good to see you, Moshe. I've been enjoying your talk. You're looking well. And thank you, Seth, for doing the interview duties here. One of the things that the University of Wyoming and partially through me, partially through Seth, with the assistance of Moshe at different times have done is we send students both to tour Israel, and often we send them to take part in archaeological excavations, as you mentioned, Hukok and the mosaic-filled synagogue there. Quite an interesting site to visit. So those kinds of opportunities, of course, have sort of slowed down under COVID, but we're hoping that we will be able to get those kinds of activities going. Moshe, do you have biblical sites that you are interested in seeing? Where would you encourage people to go look? Or do you think the more exciting sites are more recent, are Roman period or Byzantine period, which would roughly correspond to the Jerusalem Talmud period? Or would you go all the way back? What couple of sites would you say you've got to come see this just because it's interesting?
So you're talking about sites that have already been dug and discovered,
Yeah.
and you're telling me, well, again, it's really personal, but and subjective. But I mean, you have, basically the opportunities are infinite, and even if I gave you my 3 choice places today, probably by next week, some new areas would be discovered, and they just recently discovered up north. They discovered this ancient city in Nafach. They've undug a parking lot in Jerusalem and discovered a city, buildings from the first temple. I mean, so things are always changing and always happening. We always think that the past is set in concrete and the future is malleable, but it turns out that our past here is also constantly changing. We're constantly finding new things. I guess, each person has to decide what his area of interest is, and based on that, to choose what he wants to go and see, and to realize in advance that you'll be quite a challenge to be able to go through everything that you want to see.
So one of the things that really interests me about these opportunities and the digs we're describing, because we've had a succession of digs, and I think that's the way archaeology works, right? You have the very successful dig, and then everything that's wonderful gets moved out, and so you get to look at a few walls, perhaps if you go visit it. But there are remarkable resources in the Israel Museum and in museums all across Israel, and then in some local museums that represent what was found there. But the University of Wyoming has had digs participated in digs at what Tel Mikne, I think was the first one I remember, Paul, recently, with Cy Gittin, at Hukok with Judy Magnus, and that's the one with the remarkable mosaics that you'll see written up in National Geographic, right? Foxes with torches tied to their tails, and elephants, and all kinds of things you never imagined being a floor. And more recently, I think with Megiddo, which for our students, site of biblical Armageddon, right? Where you can look out across this vast plain and imagine. So things are, as Moshe said, always changing, and the past changes for us too in Israel, just what's available to us and where you find it. And I think one of the things that we forget too is that excavations, start with a tell that is built up with those sandwich layers you were talking about. And then of course, the business of archaeology is to bring it right back down. And so it's a really interesting phenomenon. Opportunities for our students include things these days, I believe, like occasionally internships at the Albright Archaeological Institute in Jerusalem that we've supported. And Seth, maybe you could talk a little bit about your course that starts in Israel and then goes to Jordan and to remarkable opportunities and artifacts there.
Well, I'm happy to talk about my course, and I will also mention in terms of the historical excavations. I actually like Moshe's reference to Navi Samuel. I haven't gotten there all that often, but this was one of my first hikes in 1969 when I visited the land of Israel. It was very different over there. The area from which we started was no man's land. And to go to a biblical site like Navi Samuel through no man's land was quite interesting. And in more recent times, there was a Jewish community in up to 1947, 1948. Is one of the places where Jews were forced to leave under the Jordanians. It was an interesting narrative going up to the present time. And it probably also was Crusaders. The tour guides assumed that this was the Scopus that the Crusaders talked about, not the Mount Scopus that we talk about today. It's interesting narrative. There's not an awful lot of archaeology, but it's fascinating to do that. In terms of my trip, it's not going to go this summer, presumably, but in the past, what we've done is we've gone to some archaeological sites. I've made a point of meeting Jewish families and individual Muslims and spending time in Christian centers as well, walking through Nazareth and walking through some of the Christian areas. We've gone to the Holy Sepulchre, and I actually explained to them that the number of Christian communities in the Holy Sepulchre is actually very tiny. They only have a small number of recognized Christian communities. There are some that are totally shut out or only partially shut out. The poor Ethiopians are only allowed on the roof. The Protestants, they're in they're near the Albright Center, around the corner from the Albrights, because they got around too late. And for American students who are only familiar with Protestantism, this is quite amazing. The Anglicans and the Lutherans have no part of it. We went to Jordan in addition. We went to Petra and to Jerash. Everybody has heard about Petra, but Jerash is also a phenomenal site. And when the security situation allowed it, it's actually a complicated situation, but when the security situation was such that we could go, I took my students to Egypt as well, where we climbed the traditional Mount Sinai according to most local traditions. This goes back to the patron saint of Middle Eastern tourism. This is Queen Helene, the mother of Constantine, the emperor. Back in the early 4th century, who went around declaring all of these locations. At the top of Mount Sinai, there is the location where Moses was hidden under or by a rock and saw the saw God pass by, and a little church and a little mosque and so on. It's actually quite fascinating, and I'll put in a pitch. The best gem of all of the museums that I could ever recommend people going to that's worth a trip from anywhere, Santa Caterina Library has a museum where you can see the first manuscript of the New Testament and gorgeous icons. So that's only a few of the things that we did. And we tried to do Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, deal with contemporary issues, talk about borders. and so on. In terms of opportunities, most universities in the state of Israel have Ulpan, intensive language study, and Moshe's school, Netanya Academic College, has started an Ulpan recently that would love to have people consider as well. We have sent people to Haifa and to Jerusalem and to Beersheba. I'm not aware that we've sent anybody to the Technion and the Weizmann Institute, which are on the science and STEM side of things, although presumably we could do that as well. Students have studied international relations. They have studied, and Beersheba was either a chemist or a physics for junior abroad. The Hebrew University of Jerusalem, one of our students did a Thrive program that dealt with Jewish sources and putting them into a contemporary area. Moshe told me that Netanya Academic College has a certain amount of service projects that are available in Netanya, a place which has a lot of opportunities for that. And if students are interested in serving, I've had some students work with the Greek Orthodox who've had serving in Christian areas, and the Jewish and possibly even some of the Muslim communities in the United States can put our students into areas for public service as well.
That is wonderful to know and to be able to share. And I'll just mention Sarah Robinson. If you step in for a second, I'll introduce you. Sarah Robinson is, there she is, an assistant director in education abroad. And with Shelley Jewell, for the students who are in our audience and have questions, it's Sarah and Shelley can help you considerably as you plan what you would like to do in the Middle East and in fact all around the world. Sarah, is there anything that we've missed that you would mention as a program?
Seth covered a lot of them. In addition to the language programs, there are some really incredible peace and conflict resolution studies programs available at Haifa and at the Hebrew University. And they also offer summer programs for students who are unable to get away for an entire semester. And they're just really excellent. The university is, of course, wanting to increase our presence in Israel. And so that's an exciting opportunity for students as well. And I think that it's important for students to really understand the value of studying in Israel and what it offers. And if there are questions or concerns, we're really happy to talk to them about that. And I traveled to Israel with Seth back in, I think, 2010 or 11. And so I have been there and visited these campuses as well. And I'm happy to talk to students about it.
Excellent. And as Sarah mentioned, the university is really keen to develop its opportunities in Israel. I think a lot is going to be happening in the next couple of years. And I think, Professor Pinchuk, you're going to see more of our students. We're working on a UW in Jerusalem possibility as well, along the lines of UW in Scotland. So for faculty, that's a faculty development program to help you get to Israel and explore relationships with your colleagues, as Professor Warden and Professor Pinchuk already have a great partnership established. You may find partnerships in the future. And of course, many, many opportunities to introduce our students to a whole wide range of interests in Israel and the West Bank. And unfortunately, our time has run out, but at the end of this session, you'll see a slide that will indicate to you how you get in touch with us. And if you've left a question, as I said, in the chat that we've not yet been able to address, we will bring it to you subsequently. Just to very briefly return to Dr. Ward and Dr. Pinchuk, we could have talked a lot longer. I'm very well aware of that. But unfortunately, our time is drawn to a close. We're very, very grateful to you both for your time today. And for Professor Pinchuk, of course, remember that it's getting into the late evening for him, so we're even more grateful. So it now remains for me to say thank you to everybody on behalf of the University of Wyoming Center for Global Studies and on behalf of UW's faculty and students for really opening this fascinating window into your work. Dr. Ward, I know you're going to hear from students who want to go on that summer trip, and things are changing all the time. Who knows, maybe we'll get to go after all. And Dr. Pinchuk, I'm sure that you'll have students taking up opportunities at Netanya and service opportunities and so on. They will be very keen to follow up. And as we said at the beginning, all the best conversations start more conversations. So I think this is just, we're in the middle of your conversation actually, but really gearing up now for the bigger institutional conversation. And we're really looking forward to that. So we're looking forward to our next major conversation with you in Israel. To the audience, again, I'll remind you that our next live chat is 4 o'clock today, Wyoming time, and that's with Stephanie Anderson and Federica Bindi from the University of Rome Tor Vergata. So tune in then and you'll find things also in our archives. They're going to be posted to Global Studies. This afternoon's talk, by the way, is about the challenge of international higher education in a post-COVID era, and very relevant to what's happening with our courses in Israel this summer. But who knows, maybe the COVID era will end sooner than we think. Certainly hoping. So enjoy your afternoon, your evening, or wherever you are in the world. And again, thank you again, Professor Ward and Professor Pinchuk, and we will see you again soon.